Originally trained as a lawyer and also as a moral theologian in Argentina, Augusto holds a master's in well-being and human development from the University of Bath, a PhD in theology from Roehampton University in London, and he has been a postdoctoral research fellow at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in the University of Cambridge. His primary area of research is social ethics. After studying the connection between international development and economics, as informed by Amartya Sen's capability approach, as well as by Catholic social teaching, Father Augusto has conducted research on environmental ethics in the light of the Catholic tradition. He has also been a contributor to mainstream and Catholic media on matters pertaining to Pope Francis, Catholic social teaching, and social Catholicism more generally. As a priest, Father Augusto is presently helping at the parish of Holy Apostles in the Archdiocese of Westminster in London, where he is also an ad hoc advisor to Cardinal Vincent Nichols on environmental issues. Father Augusto has previously served as an assistant priest and chaplain to different parishes and institutions in Argentina, many of them located in the poorest neighborhoods of Greater Buenos Aires. This afternoon, he is going to address for us the perspective on environmental policy making and ethics as informed by contemporary Catholic social thought and practice, particularly with reference to Pope Francis's Laudato Si. So please join me in welcoming to Georgetown Father Augusto.
Good luck. Thank you, Tony. So good afternoon. I would like to express my gratitude to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs of Georgetown University, especially to Dr. Gerard Marnion and to all the organizers of this colloquium for giving me the opportunity to share with you some, and I would emphasize some, reflections on Laudato Si, on the care for our common home and its implications for policymaking. This letter encyclical, which is now added to the Church's social teaching, though some priests, bishops, and theologians seem to be unaware of it, is an urgent call to every person in the planet, not just to Catholics or to people of goodwill, as previous encyclicals were addressed to, but to every person in the planet, because everybody is part of the problem, therefore everybody has to be part of the solution. And the idea is to invite everybody to enter into an honest dialogue, and the Pope says honest dialogue, not any kind of dialogue, on what progress is all about, on the meaning of our life, on the world, our common home, and on how we would like to pass it on to future generations. The unprecedented socio-ecological crisis affecting humanity and the environment needs urgent change. We all know this. But the change is also in the way we produce, in the way we buy and we trade, in the way we consume, and in the way we waste. And the change is an individual change also, and a social change. So it's not just individual or just social. They go hand in hand. Hence, Laudato Si appeals to our imagination, as somebody was saying in the previous panel, as to our creativity, to our spirituality, and regarding policymaking, to our cleverness, goodness, and braveness. Yes, the world needs clever, good, and brave agents working in policy at all levels, who may lead us to a cultural revolution that breaks away from the throwaway culture or from the consumerist culture, and people who may work hand in hand with the church and other religions, fostering a new universal solidarity that leave behind individualistic and utilitarian prevailing mindsets, promoting a model of economic development that, as the Sustainable Development Goals put it, actually leave no one behind. After the encyclical was issued, I have the privilege to travel to different countries that are affected by social and ecological issues, such as Bangladesh, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Colombia, Eastern European countries, and also in West Europe. And I went there to discuss Laudato Si and how we can implement Laudato Si's message, both in the church and in the public arena. And from this experience, I reckon that there are many ways of introducing the messages of Laudato Si, but there are three relatively short yet convincing ways of doing so. One is through the words of his title, the other is through some pillars linked by the word integral development, integral ecology, integral spirituality. And the third one is through its methodology. And to relate the encyclical's message with policymaking, I will choose the methodological aspect of Laudato Si. Now, hold on a minute, don't switch off, because it's important to know that the way Pope Francis understands Catholic social teaching and its methodology is not, or the way he presents it, is not through dry epistemological explanations, but through inspiring connections with the core of the gospel. And it is this style that ignites the discussion of how Catholic social teaching should approach social problems. So don't disconnect yourself when you listen methodology. Oh, goodness me. So Laudato Si follows the traditional Catholic social teaching methodology of seeing, judging, and acting, seeing the reality particularly through the eyes of the poor and the disadvantaged, judging in the light of the gospel and of the tradition of the church, and acting or promoting decisions according to what we see and what we discern. But just a reminder that this is not Pope Francis' invention, as many people think. This is the official methodology of the social magisterium of the church, which has strong biblical roots, was embraced by Pope John XXIII in his encyclical Mater et Magistra in 1959, was confirmed by the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium Spes and Dei Verbum, was refined by Pope VI in Populorum Progressio and Octogesima Adveniens, and by St. John Paul II in his social encyclicals too. And this method has been further developed by the Latin American bishops, who applied it to analyze the social problems in their own context in the last decades, and was explicitly confirmed in the last meeting of the Latin American bishops in Aparecida, and the document has the same name, in 2007, where Cardinal Bergoglio played a key role. It comes as no surprise then that Pope Francis, not any longer Cardinal Bergoglio, as the first Latin American Pope, has explicitly approved this inductive, bottom-up, and inclusive methodology in Catholic social teaching, and has also subtly enriched it, because it is one of the things that the Pope likes to do is to apply proper tradition, means to rely on what has been said before, but to give a little bit another push, something new. Now, this method, why is important for theologians and for politicians and for all social analysts? Because it offers an antidote, although not infallible, to ideological approaches that prevents dialogue. When ideological approaches prevail, theologies, I mean the way we speak about God, and policies, the way we organize societies, are distorted. And they tend to harm rather than care for people and our common home. For this reason, this theological method breaks away in the church from the old dogmatic device of pre-stating that if a situation is hypothetically wrong or bad, the church is unavoidably obliged to reject it in theory, although it can occasionally tolerate it as a modus vivendi, as we did with the notion of democracy till recently. Instead, this method, or the ones using this method, need to necessarily admit that their seeing, or their seeing of the reality, is always affected by their view, by our sight. Indeed, a great temptation, the Pope argued, or the Pope warned the Latin American bishops in his visit to Brazil, is to pretend to have an aseptic, impartial, and objective view, so this is me, of socioeconomic or ecological problems, and therefore attempt to impose it on others that, alas, they have a contaminated, partial, and subjective views. So the initial standpoint of the Church, at least, as Pope Francis clarifies, is the reality of the crucified Christ. And we are now in the seeing. The reality, meaning of those in need, those who suffer, the poor. Now, millions of people in the world, when they wake up, and I would like to use the analogy that previous panelists were using. When we wake up with alarm clock, well, what happens when we wake up? Millions of people in the world, when they wake up, do not have access to drinking water. Many start their day by breathing polluted air. For many, the light of the new day does not come with the light of electricity, nor with the light of job opportunities. And for many city dwellers, the day starts with noise pollution and occasionally with mental pollution too. The Church witnesses this every day. We witness communities who suffer more and more frequent from extreme floods, storms, or droughts, pushing the most vulnerable members further into poverty. Now, I will match some anecdotes, if you don't mind. One anecdote, I was in Kenya a couple of weeks ago, and it was a lovely day. Imagine a lovely, lovely day. And we were in a Maasai community. And I said, what a wonderful day. Oh, it's really, really sunny. And the guy, and the chief Maasai said, no clouds, no rain. No rain, no food. I just wanted to say, oh, why did you say that? Now, we also as a church witness farming families who struggle with more unpredictable seasons. Despite they are experts in their own climate, it's so unpredictable at the moment that they cannot, there's little they can do, and which means their crops fail and their livestock die because of a lack of food and water. And we see every day the impact of growing inequality and extreme poverty, both in rural and urban areas. Laudato Si includes some of these things that we see worldwide by echoing what bishops from different parts of the world have expressed in terms of socio-ecological degradation in their own context, including the US bishops and the Canadian bishops, just to mention a few. Now, this first step, the seeing of reality, particularly the reality of those in need, is not restricted to the church. This should be a starting point of anyone who tries to link ethics, ecology, and policymaking. But if others ignore it, we as Christians cannot. We cannot be indifferent to what we see and witness every day as a church in the field. We cannot afford being trapped into ideological debates whilst we have a direct experience on how climate change threatens every attempt to reduce poverty, on how climate migration is disrupting families, communities, and countries. And another anecdote. So I was in Bangladesh, and we were talking about that. Now, do you know that Bangladesh is not affected only because of the level of the sea is rising? So the salinity of the sea is so high that pregnant women that are living in the coast, they have to migrate inland because the risk of losing their babies is enormous. Now, we are not talking about a bunch of women. We are talking about millions that migrate every week. And that distorts family, disrupts the country, and it will be worse and worse in the years coming. And also, we witness how big economic interests trump the care of vital ecosystems and the communities. And again, I was with representatives of tribes of the Amazons last year. We gathered in Colombia. And they were telling us the examples of they feel really, really lonely because neither the government nor international organizations protect themselves to these big companies that are destroying their own environment. As the United States bishops said in 2001, greater attention must be given to the needs of the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable in a debate often dominated by more powerful interests. So it would be good to listen more about this US statement in the US. In the words of Pope Francis, we need to strengthen the conviction that we are one single family. There are no frontiers or barriers, political or social, behind which we can hide. Still less is there room for the globalization of indifference. Still, in case we prefer to pretend not to see this reality, Laudato Si includes in this first step of its message what the best science available provides, what the majority of scientists in the world are seeing. Why? Is not the Pope going beyond his religious expertise? Well, not really. If the Church's mission is in and for the world, and again, I think we have to insist the Church's mission is in and for the world, not just for one country. And if such a mission is related to the overarching socio-ecological problem affecting the whole planet, then the Church's principles need to interact with other principles and the experiences of those who also live in the world. Put differently, in order to spread the joy of the gospel and discover creative paths of human advancement, Christians need to be engaged with the seeing and analysis of others. And that's what I call ecumenical in a broad sense. This comprises not only the experience of those who are being affected, the poor, or the vision of bishops, or the vision of other faiths, as is included in Laudato Si, but also those who contribute with their scientific ecological analysis. What scientists are seeing, which confirms what the Church through its local communities is witnessing and experiencing, because that's another difference, perhaps I will add to the analogy of the US military and the Church. I mean, we are not just seeing the problems of climate change, we are also experiencing, because we live in the community, we're not just invading the community. Every analogy has more dissimilarities than a similarity. It's not a criticism to the previous presentation from Miriam, but it's to confirm that dissimilarity. So what we are experiencing in the world, the scientists are saying that almost the same, that the air and the water are polluted, that global warming and climate change and the loss of biodiversity is affecting ecosystems and the quality of people's life. Worse, the pace in which we live and promote growth, matched with the weak political responses, is not helping to address and redress the issue. When we stop and see, either through the experience of those affected by social and ecological degradation, or through the best and overwhelming majority of scientists, we see human and environmental pain. This is not an idea. We see a lot of pain. And we listen to this cry, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. Now, nobody cries if we are not in pain. And this hurts. When I visit these communities, I come differently. It hurts. It's not, how wonderful my trip to Bangladesh. It really, really hurts. But this is the whole point of the first methodological step. And I'm quoting Pope Francis. The goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. If you want to translate it into a more sophisticated academic term, this is what we call empathy. But it's only through empathy that we can act. And this leads us to the second step, the judging. So we are seeing all this. Now, we cannot just see and then say, okay, then we have to do something. We need to discuss more wisely before planning and act efficiently. And the second step, the judging, we in the church, of course, if it's through dialogue, different people will come with their different views, and that's fine. That's what Pope Francis is doing. But Pope Francis is not shy in saying our judging is in the light of the gospel and of the church tradition. And not, so Laudato Si presents that the judging in chapter 2 in a beautiful way, because the chapter 2 is entitled The Gospel of Creation. So it's uniting the two testaments. Creation, the Old Testament, and the Gospel in the New Testament. But creation is a good news, it's a gospel for the Christian tradition. And it's a refined anthropological view of understanding reality. And it confirms that we are not, the interpretation of being masters of the universe is that we are part of the universe representing God. We are not here to do whatever we want with the rest of the universe. But also, the judging includes a critical, of course, negative analysis of the roots of the crisis. We're not seeing just the symptoms. So when you go to a doctor to have fever, well, you can have fever for different reasons. So when we are seeing the problem of climate change, well, there are different reasons. And that's, again, a dissimilarity we can find between institutions such as the army and the church, because we are going deep down the roots of the crisis, or we want to go deep down with others in dialogue. And that's in chapter 3, it says the human roots of the ecological crisis. Note that this ecological crisis is not just environmental. Now, the difference is the ecology is the web of life. It's not just the environment. The web of life means the way we live, the way we are interacting. We have always influenced in the ecology, but the way we are influencing now is different. Now, not only an inclusive way of proposing our biblical approach and a traditional approach, not only judging the roots or analyzing the roots, but also the Pope proposes a critical positive judgment in chapter 4 that is called integral ecology. And this has been very welcome, particularly from people outside the church. Why? Because we are experts in the church of pointing out what is wrong, aren't we? But we are not experts in promoting solutions. Now, the Pope is not promoting exactly a solution, but he's saying, okay, I have a positive judgment. This is presented why is the Pope introducing a positive judgment? Well, because if we are going to judge critically socio-ecological crisis in the light of the gospel, that means that we have to do it in the light of the good news of Jesus Christ. We cannot just say what is negative. And the way it's introduced, integral ecology, is like a paradigm able to articulate the fundamental relationships of the person, relationships with God, with oneself, with others, and with creation, with nature. It also stresses the need to acknowledge the interconnectedness between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. They go hand in hand. Why? Because they have the same root. The same root that causes one cry causes the other. So if we want to attack one cry, we cannot attack, you cannot attack one, you have to attack both. You cannot work just on ecology without paying attention to problems on work and unemployment. But likewise, you cannot tackle poverty without paying attention to how do we help the poor. The interconnectedness also between politics, economics, and ecology. Between our daily life and our culture. Between the dignity of every person and the individual needs and the common good and the needs of a wider society. Between intra and intergenerational justice. Integrating these themes is critical for a dialogue which aspires to redefine the idea of growth. In a nutshell, integral ecology means acknowledging this interconnection and not addressing the problem in only one way, because, and this is key for policy making. But just to give you some examples, it is not possible to ameliorate poverty in Sierra Leone or Liberia, when I was discussing this theme there, if actions by governmental or international agencies or companies, including some US companies, damage the environment, since the environmental disruption hurts the poor most. We know that. So helping the poor by not tackling the other thing, in fact, creates more poverty. Nor is it feasible to promote green policies in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is growing really, really fast, and they want to implement all the sustainable development goals and the green policies, which is brilliant. But it is not possible to do it without considering the importance of labor and its contribution to humanity, as is occurring with the displacement of poor communities in Addis Ababa, or in the north or in the south of Ethiopia. It would be a contradiction in terms to support one green policy at the cost of work, or to promote work at the cost of the environment. In Bangladesh, also, it is not logical to work for intergenerational justice. They are working very hard on that. If they are not paying attention to gender injustice that is occurring now. Neither is it sustainable to promote social peace in Colombia. We are all very happy with the peace that is occurring at the moment, but that's not sustainable if without addressing the problems of a utilitarian culture that wreaks havoc on the country's rich and beautiful biodiversity, or without tackling the problems of the relation between politics and economics. Loss of biodiversity will eventually foment serious conflicts among inhabitants of different regions, for example, due to the access of water. And if politics is not independent enough from big economic powers, peace will be weak and not rooted in the national culture, and we will have another conflict very soon. Now, nor is coherent to work for the promotion of the common good in the UK or in the US, a topic that often arises in politics and development, without addressing the consequences of the consumerist culture and lifestyle of its citizens. Now, I'm including it because I live in England, so I'm including this criticism. This culture threatens the global common good because, among other things, it supports the practice of unlimited exploitation and irrational use of natural resources. Now, what shall we do? Or what is Pope Francis suggesting we should do? Well, this is the last part of the method and of my talk. The acting element in Laudato Si is proposed unusually for a pope, at least unusually for a papal document, through dialogue. Dialogue is the key word of the encyclical. Now, when have you heard that? That we as a church, forget about the Pope, that we the church say, the solution is to dialogue. Instead of saying, if you don't believe that, you are going to hell. Although sometimes we would like to say that, no? If you don't tackle climate change, we will go to hell. But no, that's not the way to do it. It's through dialogue. And this is a boost for those related to policymaking in democratic countries such as the US or international agencies. Yet, Laudato Si does not provide a concrete method to walk smoothly through this international and global dialogue on progress and on the care for our common home. In this sense, examples of good dialogical processes can be brought from international, national, interfaith, or business experiences. It seems to me that theologians and social scientists need to work hard so as to fill this gap that purposely the Pope has left. And I hope that that will happen very soon. Action in Laudato Si is also suggested through, so what the Pope says is not what we have to do, but through some lines of action that we need that are critical. One is education, another is spirituality, another is politics. Now, I don't know if it happens to you, but when you discuss issues about poverty, everybody would say, Father, I know, the solution is education. Well, is it? Because just to give an example, the Second World War was initiated by well-educated people. Zimbabwe at the moment, well, is ruled by a guy that was educated by the Jesuits, our fellow Jesuits. Now, it's not education in general. Then the financial crisis was generated by well-educated people. The problem is, what kind of education? Not education, as my mother would say. And Pope Francis, very, very clear in Laudato Si, and many people just ignore this. He says that it's not merely about scientific information or conscious raising, or even about prevention of environmental risks. We were talking the risks. It's not just about that. Education is about cultivating social virtues that help people make selfless ecological commitments, because that's what we need. That help people promoting new ways of thinking about human beings, life, and society, and our relationship with nature. Forging a culture of love and a bold cultural revolution that can promote new understanding of solidarity and can encourage ways of dealing with issues differently, but particularly by having a critical approach to some myths that are going around, such as the myth of a modernity grounded in individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, and unregulated markets. So this is all the education we need. Now, in terms of politics, I will leave the spirituality at the, in terms of politics, and I'm finishing with this, apart from insisting in the importance of dialogue, the Pope cannot omit referring to some political struggles related to social ecological crisis, corruption, for example, lack of leadership, the relationship between politics and economics, the link between national and global politics, as we were mentioning before, technocratic paradigm, motivation for change, etc. But in terms of corruption, I would like to point out something very, very interesting. You will see this, hopefully. The Pope obviously mentioned corruption as a problem and a danger for our common home. But while you or me or ordinary people might tend to blame politicians, the Pope put the stress on the corruption of the elites and emphasizes that the solution to corruption comes also through active participation of non-governmental organizations and intermediate groups, not merely from politicians and law enforcement. That now brings us into the problem, you see? So it's not politicians are corrupted. We are also part of the problem. Therefore, we should be part of the solution. The Pope links also corruption. We imagine corruption as bribes of money. He links corruption with environmental pollution. And this, so for us, environmental pollution is corrupt, is something that corrupts people and environment and is against the common good and against God. Moreover, in order to be coherent with the Catholic social teaching message that change comes from individuals and from social structures, Pope Francis positively encouraged politicians to combat corruption not merely by law enforcement, but also through good practice. Now, this suggests, so good practice is you have to live what you say. Now, that brings us also into the problem. Because are we really, most of us here, we would like to combat climate change. What are we doing about in our personal lives? And I'm guilty of charges, I'm not accusing you. But this approach to Pope Francis to politicians, just in corruption, suggests that he trusts politicians to bring about change, probably more than an average citizen. Another topic for policymakers are present throughout the encyclical is short-termism. Now again, the accusation of short-termism is not just for politicians, because the problem is also present in business, particularly in the financial industry. We know that CEOs, they have a short period, they want to increase the profit of the companies, and that's their aim. And they will do that whatever the cost. And stakeholders, they say nothing about that. The Pope condemns, of course, politicians for the lack of leadership to confront this crisis. However, it's also true that he sees these weak responses as inextricably linked with economic interests and technological and economic powers, as well as the lack of culture needed to confront the crisis. So as you can see, the Pope is not trying to avoid the problem of corruption or short-termism or other problems that politicians can have, but he's saying we are also part of this problem. We are not just to blame the politicians. We are part of this political action that is needed. Just a few words of Paris Agreement. Now, hurrah for the Paris Agreement. And as Mr. Sean was saying before this morning. But the Paris Agreement, it's also a problem, isn't it? The BBC, for example, has reported that the Paris Agreement represents the best chances to save the planet. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because to fulfill the Paris Agreement, we need national implementation. Now, for national implementation, we need to change the way we behave, personally and socially. And to change, the change that is required is massive. Where are we going to find the motivation to change? It won't come because one day your president said, now we will change. It won't come. Where are we going to find the motivations? And this is what Pope Francis is very cleverly saying, hold on a minute, I have an idea. Christian spirituality is not the solution, but it can contribute for this transformation. Because Christian spirituality, because the way we see the world, the way we understand it, we can bring that change about. But for that, we need to do it as a church, to help politicians to implement the Paris Agreement in their own nations. Now, perhaps, of course, not everybody agrees with this optimism that Pope Francis has for policymakers. And I was discussing this thing with people all over the world, but particularly in the developing countries, they're very upset with politicians. And I cannot tell you what they think about our politicians in the US, because I have to be polite. But they, for example, some of the things they brought about was, well, state failures, taxation, land grabbing, all these things are not helping to tackle climate change. And politicians are very, very responsible for that. And it might be true. Nonetheless, Pope Francis' enthusiasm with politics could well be triggered by the Pope's understanding that politics must not be subject to the economy. Hence, for Pope Francis, politicians are the ones capable of leading change, perhaps even more so than business people or economists, most of whom respond primarily to the logic of the market. For this reason, the Pope insists that in order to overcome the myth of progress and to find new models of development, able to produce wealth while improving and not destroying the world, we need not only creative business vocations, but also capable and brave politicians. Politicians that far-sighted enough to see beyond immediate political needs, wise enough to understand global as well as local problems, and open enough to seek honest dialogue and international enforceable agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Augusto. So we have time for a few questions, and I'd like to set the ball rolling by putting this one to you. So after Laudato Si was released, President Obama praised the Pope and praised him for his courageous stance and said so much in that document was in agreement with what he wanted his own government to do. More recently, The Guardian in London gave an editorial saying Pope Francis was one of the few people, one of the few major world leaders taking positive steps to try to make a positive difference on environmental change. With so many initiatives going on at governmental level and NGOs and different groups campaigning for the environment, where does the rubber really hit the road? How can Pope Francis really influence the policymakers who are really deciding the policies that cause the most damage to our environments? And why should they listen to him?
Well, that's a very good question. First, just it's always good to bring examples. And I went to Bonn before Paris, and I was asked to prepare a side panel with different faith-based organizations and the Vatican. And of course, they gave us the slot was at the same time the president of France was talking. And we thought, nobody will come. Who would bother? This was before Laudato Si. Well, the room was packed. We couldn't fill everybody into the room. And we introduced the message. Basically, it was almost the message of Laudato Si. And they were delighted. People from all different countries. They said, we are stuck into an ideological discussion. We need the charisma and the wisdom of the church, the charisma of the Pope and the wisdom of the church to help us go through this ideological barrier. Because we need an ethical approach that can underpin the debate. And so they are willing to listen because of that, because they know that with merely a political approach, or by the way, the economists, with a mere economic analysis, there's no solution. So they're open to dialogue. And by the way, the Paris Agreement, I don't know if I had the chance to be there. There are many delegations in their speeches quoting Laudato Si. Now, where on earth did you listen to an international gathering of nations and quoting the Pope? I mean, you tell me. So there is an influence. And the way we got to an agreement, well, all the faith-based organizations that we were talking about before, we were there pushing a little bit. So there is a concrete relationship between further agreements and between Laudato Si and agreements. Now, the how is, I think the church what is trying to promote is a space for dialogue. I think some of the conflict of interest is so high that what we can provide as a church, particularly the Catholic Church, I mean, we are together with other faiths, by the way, but particularly the Catholic Church, and the other faiths are supporting us, we can provide a space for dialogue. A space for dialogue that you cannot find in an official meeting at the UN. Why? Well, because the representative of the US and the representative of China, well, they have to defend their own interests, and they are stuck on that. But we can provide a dialogue that goes beyond policy, that goes directly through the idea of what kind of human beings do we want to be now, and what kind of world do we want to leave to your children? Because that question, every politician from every nation, from every culture, from every religious background, is willing to answer. This is not something about we are imposing our faith. We are proposing a dialogue. Plus, the proposal of Catholic social teaching, they love it. Now, we were complaining in the Catholic Church that the Catholic social teaching used to be, well, the best kept secret in the Catholic Church. But it's not any longer now. Perhaps they don't know that it's Catholic social teaching, but they know at least that some principles, and they're willing to apply them.
Very good. Let's open up to the floor for any questions for Father Zampini. There's one here.
You mentioned the challenge of the Paris Agreement is implementing it, but that's, of course, also the challenge of Laudato Si. And I know one of the great pleasures of this document has been the way it has been inviting dialogue all around the world, within the church and outside, on ways to implement. From your travels, can you tell us some of the ones that you feel are the most promising and some of the ones that you think are still the obstacles to trying to implement, to practice what we preach within our church on Laudato Si?
Oh, thank you very much for that question, Miriam. That's an excellent question. I will start with a negative now. From my experience, within the church, the resistance comes from the wealthy churches, unfortunately. And this is why education, again, is not just, is coming basically from the US and the UK and some European countries. Not of all, because to be fair, well, churches are diverse, but of some bishops and a few, but some bishops they just want to ignore them. And even parish priests, they are also very busy they think they're very busy to deal with these issues. But the good news, even in these wealthy churches, is the good news is when we introduce, for example, in the UK, we used an experiment to introduce Laudato Si through the last chapter of Laudato Si, that is through the celebration, through the sacraments, because many people forget about that, so the spirituality, and they love it, and it works. So from the last chapter, you go to the second, and then you go to the first. So you start from at the end. For some reason, I don't know, it's still difficult for these people who are reluctant to accept the Laudato Si to say, listen, we are a universal church. Catholic means universal. And I'm coming and saying the church is experiencing it, but that argument doesn't seem to work very well. But the sacramental, it works. Now, the good news also in the developing world is that there is no divide here between conservatives and liberals. I was invited a month ago to Kenya, the Diocese of Lodwar, by the Bishop of Lodwar, who was trained by the Opus Dei. And he invited me to do a workshop on Laudato Si to all the dioceses. But why they don't have that divide? Because they know that this is a reality in their own diocese, with their own people. So the debate that we are having here in the UK and the US about climate change or implications, but for them that's not a debate. The debate is how to respond. And also the debate of, is it part of our spirituality or not? That's not a debate in Africa, in Latin America. It is part of the problem is how. So what does it mean that it's part of our spirituality? That's the challenge that they are facing. And a third, perhaps in the middle between the good news and the bad news, the challenge is linked with something in your panel, I think it was mentioned, or in the first panel, it was about the finance and the technology thing. So my experience from my traveling is every people wants to progress. Even the poorest person, they want to catch up. Now, we know that it's impossible if the developed world catch up with the developing world catch up with the developed, we will explode. Now, we cannot say here in the US to people in Kenya, I am sorry, you got late to the party, just stay where you are. Now, if we don't want to say that, we should be able to say something that Pope Benedict said before. We need to transfer the know-how of technology and the financial of technology for you to develop, because otherwise we will be hypocrites. And I think that the poor countries, they know that. So the challenge will be, how would this financial transfer of technology be, how can we implement that in reality? And how can the church also help that to happen?
Okay, I think we may have time just for one or possibly two brief questions if there are further thoughts to come from the floor. Or if not, I have, okay, one here, and then let's just take both of these at once,
Yeah,
and then.
So I'm being too long with
No.
Actually, just building on the conversation we're having right now, how do we encourage people in the developed world to be more reflective about the way in which they consume and the way in which they may have to stop consuming as much or change their consumptive practice so that the developing world can achieve a standard of living that we enjoy here in the developed world?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll take the second question as well, right, but before you answer.
Yeah, it's a question about dialogue, which sounds simple, but it's to be done openly in the way that Pope Francis done is easier said than done. So some pointers of how to really do it Francis style in a environment of ideological gridlock.
Yeah.
And just to add one final question to that, and you can answer them all at once. If you could have policymakers read just one chapter of Laudato Si, which one would it be and why?
Well, we'll start with that. I would read the chapter 5 for policymakers because it's so encouraging. If I was a politician, I would read that to say, oh, wow, this is really, really encouraging. If I was a priest, I would say the last chapter because it's also encouraging for their own faith. But for politicians, chapter 5 is, the problem with Laudato Si, but it's not the problem, I think it's the strength. It's so well weaved, the chapters, that is, but start with chapter 5, and then you can move on. especially because of we need some extra motivation. Again, the change that we need, that is needed, is massive. It's not just I have to twist a little bit of my life. It's not the divestment, change of fossil fuels, change that we are talking about serious changes that is costly. So for that you require some extra passion. And for me, the chapter 5 for policymakers are, listen guys, you are key players on this, and the Pope is encouraging you to do it. You are agents of change, you can do it. Then in terms of dialogue, yes, I mentioned that for me, social scientists have, this is on purpose, but because to be fair with his proposal, he cannot say this is the way you have to dialogue. He's waiting for social scientists who are experts in processes of dialogues to come in to the conversation. Now, for me, the best way of doing so is to bring examples. We have lots of examples of concrete, good process of dialogues. From my experience, for example, the interfaith dialogue that Hans Küng proposed a couple of years ago, it was excellent. It was excellent. You have to look at the process. It doesn't matter what they discussed. Then some process of dialogues that has been successful in the UN could work. Also, from a philosophical perspective, there's a new movement about the kind of neo-Socratic dialogues or something like that. Then, but then social scientists, they have, because what social scientists can bring also, even if they don't have the solution, can bring what are the key problems when we set up a dialogue. For example, the difference of voices, the difference of power. I have to admit that when I travel to these countries, I feel like emotionally trapped because I'm from the south, I'm from Argentina, but I live in London. But when I travel to these countries, I really think the way we are living is affecting them. And we are saying this is what you have to do. I think, so the balance of power, but there's a lot of literature in the social sciences as well. I think the social scientists have to be a bit more active, in my way, publicly in this thing. And in terms of motivation, thank you very much for the question. And I would like to finish with that because I think that depending on the audience. So if you're talking to a Catholic audience in a parish, there are different ways of doing it. But I experienced that not everybody's an academic, or not everybody's an intellectual like most of you here. You will be thrilled if I throw a good idea, but not everybody is like that. People are not moved merely by logic arguments. People are moved by other things. And I found in the Catholic Church, at least the ones who go to church, people are moved by the sacraments. Just to give an example, when I celebrate a baptism, in Argentina at least, the church is packed. Every baptism is at least 400 people, and I'm on my own. But even the ones who don't come to church come to the baptism. Now, for example, a good way of doing it in the Catholic Church is water life. Well, the problem of water is critical for the ecological degradation. Can we not have a kind of catechesis in this baptism? The people will be moved by that. The same with death, with the funerals, the same with the Mass. And the Mass moved some Catholics. And if we can have so that will bring the implementation of change to use different kind of energy in the churches. So what I would say is, in terms of policymaking, the title was, what has the Pope to say to politicians? So I would like to finish saying, well, for me, what the Pope would like to say is, we support you, and look at this. Millions of people around the world, at least in my church, in the Catholic Church, have turned to renewable energies in their parishes. Millions of people around the world are now buying differently and more responsibly. Millions of people around the world are now not just aware of the negative consequences of this, but are aware of the roots of the crisis, and they're changing their lifestyles. And we are talking about millions of people. So you're not on your own, but you don't want to miss that support either. because you are politicians after all. So, but for me as a church, what I would love to say to policymakers in the next COP, for example, it won't happen because the next COP is next month, but in the following one is, listen, this is what we did. We've done our homework in the church. If we're not able to say that, it will be problematic for us to contribute to the dialogue of how to redefine progress.
Father Zampini, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights and experience. Thank you. Wonderful. Fantastic.
Thank you, sir.